Well, one of the most exciting things that can ever happen to us is when we discover something new that then goes on to become a really important part of our life. Now, this can happen when, for instance, someone discovers a new pastime or a new interest, something that hasn't been part of their life before, but they suddenly get really into, and it rapidly consumes them. It can happen when someone becomes a parent or a grandparent for the first time, without very swiftly becoming just about the most important part of their life. It can happen, of course, when someone becomes a Christian, with everything that involves very suddenly assuming a centrality to their life that wasn't there before. But actually, for Christians, actually within their faith, it can be that they sometimes discover something that they hadn't recognized before, that hadn't really, in all honesty, been particularly central to their Christian life, that then, once they've discovered it, goes on to become really central and really life-changing and transforming. And for me, the thing that really comes most obviously into that final category is this: the resurrection. I was baptised as a baby. This morning we had Charlie and George Bailey baptised this morning. It was wonderful. But I was baptised as a baby. I was brought up in the Christian faith with God and Jesus always part of my life. And that early Christian experience included celebrating Easter and knowing and believing that Jesus rose from the dead. But it wasn't really until I was around about 30 that I grasped just how central the resurrection is to the Christian faith. See, up until I was around about 30 years of age, I more or less thought that the resurrection was something unique to Jesus, with the hope for followers of Jesus being quite different. The hope for followers of Jesus being this: going to heaven when you die. The resurrection of Jesus and going to heaven when you die for Christians. Now, that, if I'm honest, the disjuncture between those two things left quite a lot unclear. And so discovering that resurrection isn't just about Jesus, but about all those that belong to him as well, and discovering more about what resurrection meant, was something that brought a clarity and a focus and a direction to my Christian faith that it hadn't had before. And the chapter of the Bible that most explains the resurrection in greatest detail and most clearly is that chapter which we had a couple of sections read from just now. Chapter 15 of Paul's first letter to the church at Corinth. 1 Corinthians, as it tends to be known, is a very long letter in which St. Paul deals with a whole range of subjects. There are a whole series of seemingly diverse subjects that Paul wants the church at Corinth to grapple with. And near the end of the letter, because it provides the foundation basically for everything that he's been saying, Paul gives this lengthy explanation or exposition of the resurrection. 1 Corinthians chapter 15 is 58 verses long. It's a very long chapter, and in places it's quite complex. But it's also possible to boil down what Paul is saying in this chapter about the resurrection into 5 basic points. And these 5 points can help us, I believe, to understand the resurrection a lot more clearly, and therefore to have much greater clarity about our Christian lives. And the first of these points is this: Paul talks near the start of the chapter about the importance of the resurrection of Jesus. Paul, at the start of chapter 15 of 1 Corinthians, speaks about the gospel, the good news that he preached. And he's very clear that central to this is the death and resurrection of Jesus. And this involves Paul reporting that the risen Jesus appeared to Peter and then to the 12, I think we've got the text here, to 500 people all at one time. We don't read about that in the Gospels, and sometime later to Paul himself. Paul is pretty invested, in other words, in showing just how much witness there was for these crucial events. But the most important thing that Paul wants to emphasize is the meaning of this. He says these words: If Christ has not been raised, Paul says, if the resurrection is a load of rubbish, if it never happened, then our preaching of the gospel is useless, and so is your faith. And later on, he says these very similar words. He says, if Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile, it's pointless. You are still in your sins. And that latter point is really crucial. Paul makes it clear elsewhere that when Jesus died on the cross, the sin of the world was condemned. I think we've got a picture of Jesus on the cross there. The sin of the world was condemned, and those belonging to Jesus were set free from its power. But the thing that showed that that victory had been won was what happened 2 days later on Easter Day. Jesus coming alive again. The resurrection of Jesus, Paul says, is the definitive sign that everything wrong with this world, sin, evil, even death itself, has been defeated. And from that point, Paul proceeds to his second key point in this chapter, which is this: the connection between the resurrection of Jesus and the resurrection of all those who belong to him. The resurrection of Jesus is clearly crucial to Christianity, but it's not unique, because from this point in the chapter, Paul starts to focus mainly on the future resurrection of all those who belong to Jesus. But he makes a firm connection between those two things by describing Jesus as the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. Now, that's a rather strange expression, the first fruits. What does it mean? Well, the first fruits were the first part of the harvest. And in a world dependent on agriculture, in a world dependent on farming, the first fruits were the crucial sign that all would be well, and that the rest of the harvest was on its way. So when the first fruits came in, people would be celebrating and breathing a sigh of relief, because that was the tangible sign that the rest of the harvest was on its way and was going to happen. And that's why a lot of that was dedicated to God in thanksgiving. And the resurrection of Jesus, Paul says, is similar. It's the definitive sign that the resurrection for all of his followers is on its way. The resurrection for everyone who belongs to Jesus. Paul, in this section, speaks about this future resurrection as a time when Jesus will reign with those who belong to him over the earth, and how Jesus will destroy everything wrong with that earth, until the point where he can hand the kingdom over to God the Father, so that God can be all in all. It's very, very thorough. It talks about the fact that Jesus will reign and put everything right, all injustice and so on, until the point where all of that evil, all of that stuff that's wrong is eradicated, and the world is as God always intended it to be. And that's the really important point about this and our future resurrection. The way that it proclaims that everything that is currently wrong and unfair about this world will one day be very deliberately put right. Injustice fairly obviously exists on a global and national scale, doesn't it? We only have to switch on our television sets, we don't have to be watching them for that long, to be confronted with everything that's wrong in this world and the seemingly impossible task of that ever changing. We can watch it and we can think, this is so widespread and so complex. How can any of it be ever put right? But it's also true on a personal level as well, isn't it? There are things that happen in our own lives which can seem very, very unfair, and quite often are that. Believe in the resurrection, and we know those things matter to God as well, that he's not indifferent to them. And just as God the Father raised Jesus from the dead, reversing that cruel and unjust sentence of his crucifixion, so the resurrection of all those who belong to Jesus shows that God will one day reverse all of the injustice and all of the unfairness in this world. And that's a wonderful reassurance to all of us. And it links to Paul's third point, which is this: Paul's third point in this passage is the difference that the resurrection makes to our suffering. Paul was someone who was used to suffering because of his Christian ministry. And he makes it very clear that his motivation for enduring this was his belief that God would one day reverse all of this through the resurrection. That's the reason why Paul was prepared to put himself in danger and, in his words, fight wild beasts in Ephesus. Now, we're not entirely sure what Paul means by that. He might be talking literally, that he had one point in the arena, or he might be talking metaphorically. But basically what Paul is saying here is that none of the tough things that he's gone through made any sense if he was doing those things purely for human gain. Paul quotes an ancient prophet to say, if the dead are not raised, if there's no resurrection, then people might as well eat, drink, for tomorrow we die. That's a phrase that's still quoted sometimes today, and Paul uses it to say, look, if there's no future resurrection, then people might just enjoy whatever is available at the moment because there ain't no future coming. It also seems that it was common for some Christians to be baptized on behalf of those who had already died, perhaps for their Christian faith. It may be that there were some people who were persecuted and martyred for their faith, and they hadn't got to the stage of being baptized yet, and so other Christians were sort of baptized on their behalf. Now, it's a somewhat strange practice that we don't do today, but Paul makes the point that if there's no resurrection, then it's a total waste of time. Being concerned about those who have died because of injustice, sort of complete waste of time if there's no resurrection. If there is a resurrection, then we know that all of those things not only matter, but they matter to God, and they'll one day be very deliberately put right. And the key thing here is that belief in resurrection is something that can make us brave. Belief in resurrection is something that can make us courageous about doing the right thing in our lives. You see, if we believe that this life is all there is, it's really difficult to be courageous, because anything that puts our present life at risk will appear foolish. Not just sort of our life existing, but perhaps our livelihood. You know, the investment that we've built up in certain things. If this life is all there is, then anything that puts that at risk is frankly rather foolish. But if we believe in resurrection, as Paul did, as someone like Martin Luther King did, if we believe in resurrection, then we'll be prepared to show tremendous courage in standing up for what we know is right, because we'll know that even the worst possible consequences of that aren't going to have the final word. So whereabouts in your life at the moment is that sort of courage needed? Where might God be calling you to stand up for something or for someone, knowing that you're acting in line with the God who will one day reverse all injustice and vindicate those in the right through his promise to bring resurrection to those who belong to his Son? All of us at points need courage. We very often need courage to do the right thing in situations where that can appear rather foolish and putting our own interests at risk. Courage is vital in such situations. It was vital for Paul, vital perhaps us as well. And resurrection is the path to that courage. Really being clear about what resurrection means is the path to us living courageously for God in the present. That's Paul's third point about the resurrection in this great chapter, and his fourth point concerns this: the nature of the resurrection body, the future resurrection body that those who belong to Jesus will be given. Now, Paul probably deals with this in response to people who were mocking and ridiculing the whole idea of resurrection, asking how on earth dead people could possibly be raised and sneering at what kind of body they could possibly come back with. And it is a fair question. It's a fair question really at any point, but it's particularly fair in the light of modern science, which has shown us that death and decay is really built into the whole process of human life. And Paul's answer, which he takes considerable time over is to show that the resurrection body that we will receive will be of a totally different order from our present ones. Our resurrection bodies, Paul says in this passage and plenty of other verses as well, as I say, he spends quite some time over it. Our resurrection bodies, Paul says, will be firmly physical. Sometimes these details are read as though Paul's saying, no, it won't be physical, it will be sort of spiritual instead. But Paul is saying our resurrection bodies will be firmly physical, but unlike our present bodies, these bodies will be imperishable. They'll be glorious, they'll be powerful, they'll be spiritual in the sense they're animated by God's Spirit, and they will bear the likeness of the man from heaven. In other words, Jesus. So why is any of this important, this detail about the resurrection body? Well, for Paul it's important because it signals that resurrection is all about the abolition of death itself. Death is so much part of the world in which we live that its absence is almost impossible for us to comprehend, isn't it? And there are plenty of popular expressions that reflect this. So when you hear people saying life's too short, normally in response to the suggestion that they should go out of their way to do something difficult, when you hear people saying life's too short, that is basically a statement about the certainty and really the finality of death. When you hear people say that expression, there are only two certainties in life, death and taxes, that is also saying much the same. You know, these two great negatives are here to stay. There'll always be taxes and there'll always be death, with the sense that that will be final, that it will eventually win. Slightly less politely, you'll sometimes hear the expression, life's a bitch and then you die. Now, they're all very cynical. They're all essentially declaring that the certainty of death makes any long-term aims that we might have about life rather pointless. Paul makes it clear, in contrast to that representing as it does the defeat of death, the resurrection defies all of that. All of that cynicism is utterly defied by the resurrection. And near the end of this great chapter, Paul says these words, the real climax of what he says. Paul is a master of poetry as much as a great theologian, and this great climax to the end of the chapter, or near the end of the chapter, declares this: we will not all sleep, we will not all die, death won't have the final word, but we will all be changed. For the trumpet will sound, the dead will be raised imperishable, and we will be changed. For the perishable must clothe itself with the imperishable, and the mortal with immortality. Then the saying that is written will come true: death has been swallowed up in victory. Now, when I hear those words, particularly that first line, we will not all sleep, but we will all be changed, my mind goes back to when my twins were born in 1997, and I received this card, myself and Katie, from members of our church in Kuhrt. And it's a typical card you give to people having children for the first time. And because we were having twins, the person obviously thought it was pretty appropriate to send that verse, we will not all sleep, but we will all be changed, with a baby with a nappy on below. So there can be jokes about that particular part of this passage, but of course it's really serious. Silliness aside, those words are a wonderful, transforming vision. And they're linked to the final point that Paul makes about resurrection in this chapter, which is this: the agenda that the resurrection inspires. You see, we might think that after 57 verses, all about the resurrection, Paul would end this chapter by saying something like, and so what a wonderful hope you have got to look forward to. But he doesn't. Instead, and in the light of everything that he said about the resurrection, Paul says these words. Paul says, therefore, my dear brothers and sisters, in the light of everything that he said about the resurrection, stand firm. Let nothing move you. Always give yourself fully to the work of the Lord, because you know that your labor in the Lord is not in vain. What Paul is saying in these verses is that because of the certainty of our future resurrection, we can throw ourselves into God's work in the present, knowing that we're on the winning side. 2 chapters earlier, in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, that famous passage that's often read at weddings, Paul says that when everything passes away, or everything else passes away, faith, hope, and love will remain. And he says the greatest of these is love. A lot of you will be very familiar with those words because you'll have heard them countless times read at weddings. But 1 Corinthians 13 is really just another way of saying what 1 Corinthians 15 is saying, that the future resurrection of those who belong to Jesus, the future when everything evil, including death itself, will be completely abolished, that makes every single act of faith, hope, and supremely love that we do in the present entirely worthwhile. Because it's all part of building for something permanent and working for the day when everything wrong with this world, everything that spoils and defaces and mars it, will be completely swept away in the resurrection that God has promised to bring us. So, I suggest that the hope and the message of resurrection badly needs to be rediscovered. It's something that when I woke up to really made so much more sense of so many aspects of my Christian faith that frankly up to that point weren't really joined up together. Resurrection stands at the heart of our faith, and it makes sense of so much, particularly the agenda that we're called to pursue. It needs to be rediscovered by every Christian today because its hope is so transforming. Not only does it make further sense of the resurrection of Jesus, it provides us, as I say, with a hope that enables us to face our fears, to show courage, and to throw ourselves into the work that God has called us to, knowing that we're on the winning side. Let's pray for a moment.